Thank you, Bruce. It's a big topic. I'd like to talk about the role of ICTs, not only in adaptation to climate change, but in the context of achievement of sustainable development. I thought there was a very good definition of sustainable development given yesterday. I think it was a quote from Prime Minister Brown, if memory serves, that sustainable development involves balancing economic growth, social justice, and environmental care. So it's a big task, the task really in which a lot of the debate about environmental issues in general and climate change in particular is taking place. And I'd like to try to situate the discussion in that broader context. As well, I'd like to build on some of the ideas that have been thrown out in previous sessions, I think particularly yesterday, ideas, for instance, that behind the technical challenges that are the focus very much of this symposium, there are often rather difficult and complex social issues lurking, issues that may involve changes in individual behavior, changes to corporate culture, and broad changes in economic and social organization, the so-called systemic effects of ICTs. I think another of the ideas I'll try to pick up on is that in confronting these kinds of broad social changes, it's often a very good idea to try to get stakeholders together in non-traditional decision-making governance structures, simply because one of the main effects of ITUs, as I think one of the lead-off speakers said yesterday, is to greatly diffuse power to the people. The old rallying cry that I'm old enough to remember from the 1960s was invoked yesterday to capture the spirit of what ICTs in general, and I guess the internet in particular, do in terms of economic and social transformation. In line with that, I thought I really probably need to make one change in the title of my presentation. I'd use the word margins, thinking of areas of the world that are marginal geographically, economically, or parts of society that are marginalized. But in a sense, I think in this context, for this audience, it's better to talk about edges, because the word edges resonates with the notion that the transformative potential of ICTs in general and the internet in particular lie in the fact that they locate intelligence at the edges of networks, place enormous power in the hands of individual users and communities, enable creativity and the sharing of creativity in ways that's never been possible before. And I guess what I'll attempt to suggest in the presentation, that tapping into this creative power is one of the keys, not only in using ICTs to adapt to climate change, but to achieve broader goals of sustainable development. To begin with, I think it's worth considering what exactly adaptation involves. This definition is taken from the website of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the glossary, and it's interesting because it draws attention to the fact that there are really two sides to adaptation. One is the moderation of harm. This is the aspect, of course, that currently holds the attention of public and policymakers. All the terrible things that are going to happen, what do we do about them? But there's another side as well that is highlighted by this definition, that climate change may, in certain cases, even in very vulnerable areas, involve the creation of beneficial opportunities which can be exploited. And I think it's important to keep the two sides in mind, and I'll try to show this through an example I'll be giving. Because as we know, the cost of adapting to climate change over the coming decades is estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The cost of not adapting going forward is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars on an annual basis. Clearly, enormous financial resources are going to be required to adapt to climate change. And I would like to suggest the seizing of beneficial opportunities resulting from change is part of the solution, particularly in vulnerable areas that currently lack economic and other capacities. The Arctic, that's the example I'm going to be working with, provides a very good illustration of the two sides of adaptation. This chart is from the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you see it illustrates not only that the effects of climate change are currently being felt most strongly in the Arctic regions of the world, the purple at the north, but under a business as usual scenario going forward over the next century, surface temperatures are projected to rise much more dramatically in the Arctic regions than anywhere else in the world. And if this comes to pass, the principal, most visible and most dramatic consequence of climate change in these regions will be extreme shrinkage of the ice cover, particularly over the Arctic Ocean. These charts are also drawn from the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. The chart on the left shows the minimum extent of ice coverage, I think as of 2002. The chart on the right shows the projected minimum coverage towards the end of this century, again, under a business as usual scenario. Incredibly dramatic change, and one of the consequences of this sort of change would be the opening of sea routes to navigation, both the northwest passage off the north of Canada, the light blue line on the chart on the right, and the northern sea route off the north coast of Russia on the left. And again, this sort of development illustrates the two-sided nature of adaptation. The opening of these sea routes to seasonal or year-round navigation would bring undeniable benefits to shipping companies. It would be a much quicker route to ship stuff between Europe and North America and the Orient. That would produce benefits to manufacturers of goods in terms of lower shipping costs and possibly benefits to consumers. So that's an upside, but the downside, of course, is that increased shipping traffic would pose enormous climate risks in an area of the world where ecosystems are very, very vulnerable to pollution and other kinds of disruptions. This sort of climate change in the Arctic, the upsides and the downsides would go much beyond the issue of shipping routes. Obviously, if the ice cover over the Arctic Ocean shrinks radically or almost completely disappears, the resources that lie under the Arctic Ocean seabed, which previously were inaccessible, would become accessible. And this has already triggered a race for resources among Arctic countries and disputes about territorial boundaries. At the national level, increased shipping, increased resource activity would bring opportunities to diversify the economies of northern regions and all of the circumpolar countries. To seize these opportunities, it would be necessary to upgrade existing infrastructure, develop new infrastructure. It would be necessary to involve the peoples living in these regions much more directly in the economic and social life of Arctic countries than is currently the case. But again, environmental threats would come with all of this. Perhaps most visibly at the local level, where indigenous communities, there are about 4 million indigenous people living in the circumpolar region, would face severe challenges of adaptation to a dramatically transformed physical environment, economic environment, and social environment. Issues of preservation of traditional language and culture, ways of life would certainly arise. So what can ICTs do about this to help, if you like, seize the opportunities arising from climate change and minimize the harmful effects? I think this is a big topic. The institute that I'm associated with has done a lot of work in this area, and I'll simply say what they have reported in a recent publication that's been input into the international negotiating process leading to the conference in Copenhagen next year. And just as adaptation to climate change is a complex problem, there are no simple solutions. Research shows that what you really need is a combination of top-down approaches, scenario building, emphasis on innovation, development of infrastructure, with bottom-up approaches that are focused on the vulnerability of local ecosystems, local economies, local social arrangements, focused on building the capacity at the local level required to adapt to change. And currently, governance arrangements do not do a very good job of putting together top-down and bottom-up approaches. So there's a need, feeling within the sustainable development community, that there is innovation required in how we try to govern this kind of thing. I think you can see many ways in which ICTs can play into this. I think it's very useful to use the framework that's commonly used in a lot of the literature on ICTs and the environment that distinguishes between direct, indirect, and systemic impacts of ICTs. ICTs as tools to be used with direct effects. ICTs as new media for communicating awareness and information, coordinating action, and most fundamentally, tools that enable new forms of government to be developed. Now, if we look at the challenges faced in the Arctic, I think it's very easy to see how the first and second order effects of ICTs can play into the challenge of adapting to climate change, of managing the upsides and the downsides. No need to go into detail. Obviously, the big international issues, we've in a previous session heard about the potential of ICTs to be deployed to measure and monitor climate change. At the national level, there's a need clearly to build communications infrastructure into areas where it doesn't exist and to provide services that will involve the peoples living in those regions in the new economic and social opportunities that may arise as a consequence of climate change. And again, at the national level, real opportunities in using ICTs to support the sorts of changes that Indigenous communities are going to have to go through and preserve traditional languages and lifestyles. And there's nothing new in any of this. I think all of these topics are already subject of public policy in probably all Arctic countries. What is much more difficult to see at this point, given our current state of knowledge and the current state of governance arrangements, is how ICTs can be deployed to achieve systemic effects in this extremely sort of complex challenge that climate change is going to bring to Arctic regions, how ICTs can be used to enable new approaches to governance, calling network governance, that join up top-down and bottom-up approaches and engage all stakeholders in a collective pursuit of common solutions to the challenges they face. Work is just beginning in this area. A body called the Arctic Council. It's a very innovative body that groups the governments and representatives of Indigenous peoples in the countries that live around the Arctic region, is just launching an ICT assessment study to try to begin to get a handle on what is out there in the regions, what people, particularly young people, are doing with ICTs, what obstacles they face, and what opportunities they see to use ICTs to deal with the challenges they face. The Arctic is perhaps an unusual example. Clearly, there are regions of the world that are equally vulnerable that may not have the sorts of potential upsides in adapting to climate change that the Arctic does. However, it's probably a subject that should be investigated. I guess more generally, and this goes a little bit beyond the interests of the I2, I think it's legitimate to ask what can be done at the international level to compare experiences, share information between people, and provide forums where it's possible to more comprehensively address the kinds of challenges that the vulnerable regions of the world are going to face in adapting to climate change. So I leave that question for the group to consider.